The inventory listed the oak sideboard, the silver apern, the wine cellar with 43 remaining bottles, the 3 working fireplaces, the roof that needed attention on the east wing, and one dependent, Miss Mabel Forsyth, whose arrangements were to be determined at the discretion of the new owner. Rowan Ashcroft, the 7th Earl of Dunmere, read that line again. One dependent. He set the papers on the solicitor's desk and looked at the man across from him, Mr. Tidwell, who had handled the late Lord Forsyth's affairs for 22 years and who now wore the expression of someone who had been dreading this particular conversation. "Explain that," Rowan said. Mr. Tidwell explained it badly, which was to say he explained it in the way of a man who understands that no explanation will be satisfactory. The late Lord Forsyth had fallen into considerable debt. The estate, Whitwell Park, in Northumberland, had been sold to cover it. The title had died with the man. There was a daughter. She was 23. She had nowhere else to go, and her father had not, in the final accounting, managed to arrange anywhere for her to go, and so she had remained. "She's in the house," Rowan said. "She is. I've purchased the house. You have." Rowan looked at the inventory again. One dependent, Miss Mabel Forsyth, listed between the wine cellar and the leaking roof, as though she were a problem of roughly equal magnitude to both. He drove to Northumberland the following Tuesday. The housekeeper, Mrs. Baird, met him at the door. She was a stout woman of 60, with the bearing of someone who had outlasted 3 different owners and fully expected to outlast a 4th. She gave him the tour that all housekeepers give new owners, brisk, informative, designed to communicate the minimum necessary, while making it clear that she was the one who actually understood how the house ran. He noticed the girl on the 2nd floor. She was carrying linens. She wore a gray dress that was clean but not new, and her hair was pinned up in a way that was tidy rather than fashionable. She didn't look at him. That was what he noticed first, that she didn't look at him the way people usually looked at new owners, which was with either anxiety or performance. She simply carried the linens down the corridor and turned the corner and was gone. "Who is that?" he asked Mrs. Baird. Mrs. Baird's expression shifted by some small fraction. "That's Miss Forsyth, my lord." He thought about the inventory, one dependent. "She's carrying linens," he said. "She helps where she can," Mrs. Baird said, and moved on to show him the state of the east wing roof. He didn't speak to her until the 3rd day. He had spent those 3 days doing what he always did when he acquired a new property, walking it, learning it, trying to understand what the house wanted to be versus what it had been allowed to become. Whitwell Park had been a very good house once. You could see it in the proportions of the rooms, and the plasterwork ceiling of the drawing room, in the way the south-facing windows caught the afternoon light and held it. Someone had loved this house. It had just been a while since anyone had been able to afford to show it. He found her in the library on the 3rd afternoon. She was sitting at the writing desk near the window, not writing, not reading, but looking out at the grounds with the particular stillness of someone who is trying not to be noticed. When he came in, she stood immediately, and that too was a kind of performance, he thought. The speed of it, the readiness. "Miss Forsyth," he said. "My lord." Her voice was even. Educated, he noticed. The vowels placed precisely, the way they taught in certain kinds of houses. He looked at her more carefully than he had on the 2nd floor. She had brown eyes that were doing several things at once, measuring him, not quite trusting him, deciding something, and she held herself with the posture of a woman who has been taught to take up no more space than necessary. "Sit down," he said. "Please." She sat. He sat across from her. Outside, the grounds were going golden in the late October light. "I've been told your father left no formal arrangement for your situation," he said. "I'd like to understand what you need." Something moved across her face and then was gone. "I don't require much," she said. "I can be useful. I know the house. I know the staff. I can continue in whatever capacity is helpful until—" She stopped. "Until I find another arrangement." "What arrangement?" "A position, my lord, as a companion perhaps, or a housekeeper if—" She paused. "I have some experience with the management of a household." He looked at her. "A position as a housekeeper." She was 23 years old, and she was sitting in a library that had very likely been her father's library, and she was offering to scrub his floors if that was what the situation required. "You grew up here," he said. "Yes, in this house." "Yes, my lord." He looked at the window, at the grounds outside, at the way the old oak at the edge of the lawn threw a shadow that had probably fallen in exactly that direction every October afternoon for 100 years. "You can stay," he said, "until you find what you're looking for. There's no need for you to." He gestured vaguely at the linens, at the gray dress, at the whole performance of invisibility she seemed to have arranged for herself. "You don't need to earn your place here." She thanked him. She was very polite about it, and there was something in her face that he couldn't quite read, something that looked almost like relief, but also, underneath that, something that looked like grief or guilt, or possibly both at once. He didn't know what it was. He thought about it later, in the west-facing bedroom he'd chosen because it had the better wardrobe, and decided he couldn't sort it out from one conversation. He would need more data. He was a man who believed in data. She was useful. That was the thing about her that he kept running into. She knew where everything was, which Mrs. Baird did not always, and she knew the history of every room, and she knew which of the tenant farms had been mismanaged and which had simply had a bad 3 years. She was not performing usefulness. She actually possessed it. He started finding reasons to ask her things. What was the yield on the East Fields before the last decade? She knew. What had the previous tenants in the North Cottage done wrong? And what had the land been like before? She knew that too. She walked the estate with him one afternoon when he asked about the drainage problems in the lower meadow, and she showed him where her father had tried to address them 20 years ago and where it had gone wrong. And she said here and there, and if you follow the water back to the source in the tone of someone who has been watching a problem for a very long time. "How do you know all this?" he asked her. She looked at him, and there it was again, that complicated thing happening behind her eyes. "My father talked to me," she said, "about the land. He didn't have a son. He said someone had to understand it. He said nothing. He wasn't always—" She stopped. "He loved this place," she said, "whatever else. He loved it." He thought about what that meant, to be told for 23 years that someone had to understand this land, to be the keeper of all that knowledge, and then to watch the land be sold to pay someone else's debts, to be listed in an inventory. He said, "Tell me about the drainage," she told him. His cousin arrived in the 3rd week. Mr. Bernard Ashcroft was 38, had opinions about everything, and was under the impression that Rowan's decision to relocate to Northumberland was a symptom of some variety of madness that family intervention could cure. He arrived on a Wednesday with 2 trunks and the energy of someone who intended to stay until the madness had passed. "Who is the woman in the gray dress?" he said at dinner the first night. "Miss Forsyth, the previous owner's daughter." Bernard considered this. "She's still here. She is. Why?" Rowan poured wine. "She had nowhere else to go, Rowan." Bernard set down his fork. "You can't simply— She's not causing any difficulty." "That isn't—" Bernard tried again. "She's a Forsyth. She grew up in this house. Whatever she may appear to be on the surface, she has certain claims, perhaps, or at least certain feelings about the property that could become complicated. Her father sold the property. Her father is dead. She is not." Bernard picked up his fork again. "I'm simply saying that women in her situation have been known to pursue." "She's not pursuing anything," Rowan said. "She carries linens and knows where the drainage problems are, and she hasn't asked me for so much as an extra candle." Bernard ate his soup. He had the expression of a man who is not satisfied with the answers he is receiving, but who recognizes that pressing further will not improve them. Rowan looked at the door through which Miss Forsyth had disappeared after serving as an impromptu guide to 3 questions he'd had about the cellar inventory. He thought about the drainage. He thought about her voice when she said he loved this place. He found the letter in November. He'd been going through the desk in the study, the late Lord Forsyth's desk, which Mrs. Baird had not touched because Mrs. Baird had been waiting for the new owner to sort through it, and in the 3rd drawer, beneath a stack of correspondence about the debts, was a letter. It was addressed to no one. It was sealed, and on the outside, in a hand that shook slightly, as though written by a man who was not well. For whoever comes after. Regarding my daughter. He broke the seal. The letter was 4 pages. He read it twice. Lord Forsyth had been, by his own accounting, a man who had done a number of things wrong. He enumerated them with the candor of someone who no longer had reason to manage impressions. He had borrowed badly. He had trusted the wrong men with the estate accounts. He had believed, for longer than he should have, that things would improve, and when it became clear they would not, he had done what he felt he had to do. Sold Whitwell Park to cover his debts and secure his creditors, and in doing so had given away the only thing that his daughter had ever been promised. He wrote, "Mabel does not know the full extent of it. I have not told her that there is nothing, that the debts consumed even what I had intended to leave her. She believes there is something. I have let her believe it because I am a coward, and because I have not been able to bear the way she would look at me if she knew. She has managed this house since she was 16. She has known every room of it, every field, every tenant. It was to be hers. That was always the understanding, even if the law did not make it simple. I am sorry. I am more sorry than I know how to say in a letter that I'm not sure anyone will ever read. If you are reading this, if someone is, I ask only that you understand that whatever she appears to be, she is not a leftover. She is the best part of what this place was. Treat her accordingly." He sat for a long time at the desk. Outside, it was November, and the oak at the edge of the lawn was bare now, and the shadow it threw was different from the one he'd first noticed in October. Everything was different in November. He thought about the inventory. One dependent, Miss Mabel Forsyth. He thought about her face on the first day in the library, the thing he couldn't quite read. He understood it now. It was not relief and grief at once. It was guilt. She had thanked him for letting her stay in her own house and felt guilty for doing it. He went to find her. She was in the kitchen garden, which at this time of year was mostly bare earth and dead stems. She was pulling up what remained of the autumn plantings, with the focused application of someone who needs to do something with their hands. He stood at the gate. She saw him and straightened. "Miss Forsyth," he said. "My lord." She brushed dirt from her gloves. He crossed the garden and stood near her, which meant they were both looking at dead plants, which was perhaps not the setting he would have chosen. He held out the letter. She looked at it. She looked at his face. She took the letter. He watched her read it. She did not cry. He'd half expected her to, or perhaps had half hoped she would, because then he would have known what to do. Because crying was legible, and he could manage legible things. Instead, she read all 4 pages, and then she folded the letter and held it in both hands and stood very still in the November garden with her eyes on the middle distance. "You knew," he said, "that there was nothing." "I suspected," she said. "About 8 months ago, I found some papers that I suspected." She looked down at the letter. "He was protecting you." "He was," she said. There was something in her voice that was not quite anger and not quite forgiveness. "He was." A pause. "He was also wrong," she said quietly. "I could have helped, if I'd known sooner. I was managing this house at 16. I wasn't." She stopped. "It doesn't matter now." "It matters," Rowan said. She looked at him then, directly, for perhaps the first time without measuring him for threats or calculating what she should say. Just looked at him. Her eyes were doing that complicated thing again, only now he could read it. It was the face of someone who has been told for years that someone had to understand this land, that someone had to know it, and who has been carrying that knowledge like a debt she couldn't pay. "What happens now?" she said, "to me?" He had thought about this on the walk from the study to the kitchen garden. He was a methodical man. He did not make significant decisions without thinking them through. He had thought it through. "Nothing changes immediately," he said. "You stay. You continue to help with the estate, if you're willing. Not as a servant, but as someone who knows this land better than I do. I'll have my solicitor look at the question of what, if anything, can be formally arranged." He paused. "Your father's letter says this was to be yours. The law may not agree with him, but there are things that can be done. Settled incomes. Formal arrangements that provide security." "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I'm not doing it because I owe you." He looked at the bare kitchen garden, at the empty beds, at the shape of things that would come back in spring if someone cared for them now. "I'm doing it because your father was right. You're not a leftover." She said nothing for a long time. The wind came across the garden and took the last of the dead leaves off the stems. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steadier than he expected. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "I'm also going to need you to explain the situation with the Northfield drainage again. Because I went back to look at it this morning, and I think there's a second problem further upstream." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was close, though. It was the closest thing to a laugh he'd heard from her in the 3 weeks since he'd arrived, and it stayed with him for the rest of the afternoon, in a way that surprised him. Bernard left on a Thursday. Before he left, he found Rowan in the study and stood in the doorway with the expression of a man who has something to say and has decided to say it regardless of the consequences. "She's not just a dependent," Bernard said. "I know. She's Forsyth's daughter. She grew up in this house. Bernard stopped. "You're looking at her differently than you were 3 weeks ago." "People change," Rowan said. "After 3 weeks. Rowan, Bernard." Bernard made a sound of profound exasperation and picked up his hat. "Just be careful," he said. "Not for the reasons you think. Be careful because she is clearly someone who has learned to take care of herself in rooms where no one is looking after her, and those people are not always easy to." He tried again. "Don't be another person who leaves things unspoken until it's too late." He left. Rowan thought about that for a while. He was a man who believed in data, and the data was this. He had been at Whitwell Park for 3 weeks, and he had learned more about drainage, tenant relations, soil conditions, and the precise weight of long-held silence from Miss Mabel Forsyth than he had learned from anyone in recent memory. He also thought, less practically, about the sound she'd made in the kitchen garden, the almost law. He thought about it more than the drainage. December came. He asked her to join him for dinner. Not as a servant, not as a dependent, as someone who knew the estate, someone whose opinion he was seeking. She came to dinner with the air of someone who is braced for something to go wrong and is trying not to show it. Nothing went wrong. They talked about the estate. They talked about the tenants. They talked about what the Northfield had been 40 years ago, before her grandfather had made a decision about the upper boundary that had complicated things ever since. She talked about her grandfather with an ease that surprised him. He had expected careful politeness, and he got instead genuine opinion, particular detail, the specific clarity of someone who has been paying attention for a very long time. He told her about the estate he'd grown up on, in Yorkshire. He told her about his father, who had also not always made the right decisions, but who had at least made them with conviction. He told her more than he intended to. She listened in the way that some people listen, not waiting for her turn, but actually receiving what he said and doing something with it. "You understand what it is to inherit a complicated situation," she said. "I do. Then you understand why I didn't leave," she said. "When I could have, why I stayed." He looked at her. "I understand it," he said. She nodded. She looked at the fire. The room was warm and the evening was quiet, and outside the December wind was coming off the moor with the serious intent of December in Northumberland. "My father wrote that letter 6 weeks before he died," she said. "I found the date in the corner. He had 6 weeks, and he didn't tell me." She paused. "I've been angry about that. That's reasonable. I've also been." She seemed to search for the word. "Grateful," which is harder to sit with. "I don't know what I would have done with the truth 6 weeks earlier. I'm not sure I would have been better at it than he was." She looked at the fire. "That's an uncomfortable thing to know about yourself," he said. "Most things worth knowing are uncomfortable." She looked at him then, and the complicated expression he'd been trying to read for 6 weeks resolved into something simpler. Not simpler in the sense of less, simpler in the sense of clearer, like a landscape after rain, when the air is clean and the distances are sharp and you can see exactly how far things are. She was someone who had loved a difficult thing with her whole attention and was not done loving it. He understood that. He had loved a difficult thing too, once, though he had been less consistent about it than she had. They talked until the fire burned low. He spoke to his solicitor in January. It took the better part of 2 months to arrange, and there were things that the law simply would not accommodate. She could not inherit Whitwell Park, because the law in 1843 did not much care what dead men had intended for their daughters. But there were things that could be done. A settled income, a formal designation in his household accounts that reflected her role as estate manager rather than dependent. A small cottage on the property, in her name, so that she would always have somewhere that was hers. He told her in February. The kitchen garden was still bare, but there were things beginning, underneath. She could see them better than he could, which he was used to by now. She read the documents. She read them carefully, the way she read everything, and when she was done she held them in both hands the way she'd held her father's letter, and she said, "This is more than I expected." "It's less than you were owed," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she said. Not why had he done it. He could tell from her face that she understood some part of why. She meant something else. She meant, why him? Why this man, who had bought an estate from an inventory and found her listed between the wine cellar and the leaking roof, had decided she was worth more than that. He thought about his cousin Bernard, who had told him not to leave things unspoken. He thought about October light in the library, and the November garden, and the almost law. "Because your father was right," he said, "and because I would very much like you to explain the upstream drainage problem to me again, this time without looking at me like you're waiting for me to find it tedious." He paused. "I don't find it tedious. I never have." Something in her face opened, very quietly, like a window in spring. "The upstream problem," she said, "starts at the boundary wall." "Show me," he said. She did. They walked out into the February afternoon, and the bare fields were beginning, underneath, and the oak at the edge of the lawn was beginning too. The smallest possible hints of it, just the first swelling at the ends of the branches that meant something was coming. She pointed to the wall. She explained the water. He followed and asked questions, and she answered them with the precision of someone who has carried this knowledge for years and has finally found somewhere to put it down. He proposed to her in March, in the kitchen garden among the first green things. She said yes, and then she said, "The east beds need replanting before April," and he said, "I know." And she said, "I just want to be sure you know that accepting is not the same as not having opinions about the east beds." And he said, "I would be concerned if it were." The oak had its leaves back by April. The east beds were replanted. Whitwell Park stood, as it had always stood, at the end of the drive behind the old trees, and the light came through the south-facing windows in the afternoon and held there, the way it always had, for anyone who was home to receive it. She was home.